Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. I am William Bell, your co-host on the show with Don Preston of the Preterist Research Institute. And he's with me now. Don, how are you doing?
I am doing absolutely fantastic, William. It's just, I tell you, it's been an exciting last couple of weeks, actually, with the correspondence that I have been engaged in with numerous individuals contacting me, telling me of their journey toward covenant eschatology. I received an email just this morning from an individual who had come out of dispensationalism into amillennialism. He then adopted the dominionist / postmillennial view of Gentry, DeMar, McDermott, etc. But he said it became very, very abundantly clear pretty easily and pretty early on after adopting that view that there really is no basis for futurism based upon the very hermeneutic that they provide you. And so he's now a full preterist. And so I tell you, there's just some really, really wonderful things going on with new people being attracted to the movement, with the word spreading everywhere. You and I, of course, are making our plans to go to India. Pardon me. And, you know, just some absolutely wonderful things going on.
Well, that's exciting. It's always good to hear, and I guess we should send a real nice thank you note, maybe a couple of pieces of chocolate and peppermint, to the partial preterists and the dominionists and all the rest who continue to provide a great training ground for people to come to a logical conclusion on the tenets of eschatology. And so we appreciate all their efforts. As best that they are doing and trying not to do, we still end up hearing these great messages and announcements about people who make that complete journey. And it's just a logical step when you're really paying attention to the scriptures, and we appreciate that very much. So very good.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, it is so humorous to me, and I know it is to you, that when we receive emails like this that are totally unsolicited, I'd never even heard of this gentleman before, and he tells me of his journey, and he's the one that sets out how he came to be a full preterist, and he's the one that says that the partial preterist view gave him the hermeneutic to become a full preterist, and that it's inconsistent not to be a full preterist based upon the partial preterist hermeneutic.
Yep, so, absolutely.
You know, the reason that it's so humorous is because when we as full preterists say something like that, the dominionists and the postmillennialists just get all up in arms and they get very defensive. That's just simply not true. The dominionist hermeneutic does not lead to full preterism. And then we get this kind of email. We get this kind of testimony all the time. We don't ask them if that's true. They volunteer about their journey. They're the ones who voluntarily tell us that they were consistent with the hermeneutic that the partial preterists espouse in their writings, videos, debates, etc., against dispensationalists especially. So, like I said, it is absolutely hilarious. And there's not one thing, logically, that the Dominionists can say to refute what these people are saying. There's just nothing that they can say. But that's all. I mean, that's just great, and it's what makes life interesting when you read and you receive emails like that. Well, William, we're going to continue our discussion of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 tonight, and our review of Johnny Oxendine's presentation at the Bellview Church of Christ Lectures in June of last year, pardon me, in which he supposedly gave this devastating critique of covenant eschatology. We've already discussed now how disappointing his presentation was to us. We were hoping that he would actually engage in some exegesis of the text. In fact, he did none. He talked about the text, he talked around the text, but he never went there and carefully exegeted the text. He obfuscated. He sought desperately to avoid the language of the text. For instance, Paul's twice repeated statement, those of us who are, present active indicative, alive, and those remaining until the coming of the Lord. Well, that's a pretty powerful temporal statement about Paul expecting the parousia in his generation. Well, what does Johnny Oxendine do? He says, well, that doesn't mean Paul's generation. That means that whoever it is, whatever generation it is that is alive at that time, he just uses that language. Well, that language is inappropriate to speak of generations 2,000 or 3,000 or whoever years removed. It would be inappropriate. And as I pointed out, the English grammars that I have been able to consult, who speak of the use of the editorial we, or what is known as the royal we, say that the editorial or royal we is used when a writer or a speaker is speaking of himself and his generation. Now, that's what every grammar that I've been able to find says. So if you want to say, as those men on the Bellview lectureship certainly do, if you want to say, well, Paul's using the editorial we, he's using the royal we, then by saying that, you're admitting, according to the grammars, that Paul is referring to his generation. That's a self-defeating argument. You haven't helped yourself even a little bit. And then furthermore, when you look at how Paul uses the personal pronoun in 1 Thessalonians, there's no doubt whatsoever how he used it. He didn't use it in some vague, generic, timeless editorial or royal sense. He used it to speak of himself and the apostles and that living generation of Thessalonians. There's no question about that. Just look at how he starts his entire discussion, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13. Now, this we say to you, brethren. Was he speaking in some vague, generic, timeless sense of we? Was he speaking of some far-off generation of we? That's ridiculous. And yet, that's the kind of argument that Johnny Oxendine made, and it's the kind of evidence that he ignored as he went to the text. Well, William, do you remember a conversation that you and I had some years ago? And I said to you that I was working on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, that I felt like there was probably a key to understanding 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, some, quote, simple, unquote, answer to the text that we just simply had never seen before, in addition to the time statements, in addition to the comparison with Matthew 24, 29 to 34, which really, quite honestly, it's more than sufficient to demonstrate that Thessalonians is about 80-70. But I felt like there was probably something missing that we simply had not found. Do you remember that conversation?
I do remember that conversation, and I remember the long search for finding what that issue was that we didn't know that we didn't know.
Yeah. Well, then I called you up one day, and I said, William, do you remember that conversation? And you said yes. And I said, I believe I have found that singular, powerful, irrefutable key. And that discovery was, to me, and I have used this term before, it is the atomic bomb. In New Testament eschatology, in regard to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Now, folks, if you do not have a copy of my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, let me urge you, first of all, what we're going to share with you tonight is only the tiniest bit of the hem of the garment of what can be shared about 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 5, okay? You need to understand that. My book on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 through chapter 5, verse 10, is over 450 pages long. That gives you some idea of the depth of Paul's discussion once we dig into it, once we dig into its prophetic background, once we dig into the language, and once we dig into the Greek of the text. Now, I don't have to tell most people, about 99.9% of the people, that the common view of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is this. Dispensationalists say, well, this is all about the rapture. At some point of time in the future, very, very soon, of course. And, oh, by the way, William, did you see that Mr. Baker, what's his name? Jim Baker, formerly of TBN, has gone on record that the Great Tribulation will begin in March of this year. Did you realize that?
I didn't realize it, and no, I have not seen it. I think it's just an amazing revelation.
Well, this really is amazing because according to the real dispensational view of things, you just got to catch this, folks. Here is Jim Baker, and there's a link posted on Facebook. You'll just have to look it up. But I believe it was posted on my timeline, if I'm not mistaken. But Jim Baker said the Great Tribulation will begin in March of this year. Well, here's the problem with that, folks. And I know this is a little bit of a diversion, but it's really not in one way. Because here's the dispensational view of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Soon, and very soon, Jesus will come in the clouds of heaven, but he will not be seen by the world. He will be seen only by the righteous. He will come and he will spirit away all of the righteous. You've seen the images, you've seen the movies probably. Boy, cars are wrecking, planes are falling out of the air. People just poof, disappear. Their clothes are left in a bundle on the floor. Some versions of that have them very neatly folded on the bed. But poof, they're gone. The church, that is the faithful, are caught away in this rapture. And then what we have almost immediately thereafter is a peace treaty that is signed by the man of sin, the Antichrist, and Israel. And that peace treaty allows them, Israel, to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Thomas Seiss says that during the next 3.5-year period after the rebuilding of the temple, and you would almost think, William, would you not, that it would take 3.5 years to build a temple on the scale of the Herodian temple? Wouldn't you think? I mean, after all, it took over 46. Well, actually, it took 70 years to build the Herodian temple. So don't you think it would take at least 3.5 years if the Jews are just going to start from scratch? If they're going to get rid of the Dome of the Rock, or if they're going to go at least on the Temple Mount, they're going to start construction from scratch. Don't you think it'd take a good long while to build that temple?
I would certainly think so. I don't think they'd put it up in a day or two. Or even in a year or two.
Yeah, in a year or two. So here we have the temple in Jerusalem rebuilt. But after 3.5 years, and by the way, as I started to say, Thomas Seiss says the traditional Jewish sacrifices are reinstituted and restored. That's in his book, Prophecy Watch. Okay, so we have the Jerusalem temple rebuilt. Judaism is restored. In 3.5 years, though, the man of sin breaks his treaty with Israel and sets up an idol, probably of himself, in the Jerusalem temple and begins to persecute the Jews. That is when we have the Great Tribulation. So, folks, catch the power of this. According to the standard dispensational view of things, the Great Tribulation only occurs 3.5 years after the construction of the Jerusalem temple. So let me ask you a question, folks. Has the temple been reconstructed in Jerusalem? Well, I think anybody with eyes and with any knowledge of what's going on knows the Jerusalem temple has not been rebuilt. They're not offering sacrifices. Judaism has not been restored. The sacrifices are not being offered in the temple. So for Jim Baker to say that the Great Tribulation is going to begin in March, William, his count is off by 3.5 years. And yet I can almost guarantee you that his audience is sitting there going, I better send Jim Baker some money so that he can get this news out there. Wow. Incredible. So, the dispensational view of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is that Jesus comes to take the church away in what's called the rapture. Well, the amillennialist says, no, that's not true. When Jesus comes, he comes to take the church off of the earth, that's to be sure, and he takes them back to heaven. That's true, but at that time, he burns up the earth and the cosmos. They appeal to 2 Peter chapter 3. Now, the postmillennialists have a totally different view. And by the way, some Reformed amillennialists do as well. Richard Middleton, a renowned amillennialist, certainly disagrees with the standard amillennial view. So the Reformed amillennialists and the postmillennialists say, okay, when Jesus comes again, he's not taking the church off of the earth. He's coming to dwell with the saints on a renovated, restored, Edenic earth. But 2 out of the 3 leading futurist views say that when Jesus comes, he takes the church off of the earth and takes it back to heaven. Now, this is an area in which, and you know, William, I never had seen the postmillennial justification for their view of Jesus coming to live on the earth, except Joel McDermott's argument, for instance, in my formal debate with him in 2012, in which he said, God promised Abraham dirt. He never got dirt. Therefore, he has to be resurrected out of dirt and receive a physical kingdom on earth. But I never saw any real good exegetical justification for that view, and I certainly never saw it in the debate. But be that as it may, to go back to what you and I had discussed years ago, I discovered the justification for the view that Christ would not come to remove the church off of the earth, and certainly would not come to destroy the earth. But the purpose of Christ's parousia was to come and to restore spiritual fellowship, not to live on a restored Edenic physical earth in a physical kingdom. That doctrine is false. But this key is to be found in one incredible Greek word. And folks, if you got a pencil and paper, you might want to write this down because this is absolutely incredible. When I was going through the Greek text of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, I saw where Paul said, "We shall meet him in the air." Well, William and I were raised as amillennialists, and we took that to mean in our younger days we would rise up to meet Jesus in the air, we'd meet him there, and we'd go back to heaven from there. We'd never come back to earth. We'd go to heaven from the air. Well, here's what I discovered, folks. The word meet is not the normal word for meet. It is the Greek word apontesis. We would spell that Apantesis. And in the first century, and actually for a couple of centuries before that, and even a couple of centuries after that, apontesis had a technical meaning. Now, look, folks, I want you to understand something. I document what I'm sharing here with you. I document it from, number one, the lexicons, number two, from historical sources such as Josephus. I document it from the New Testament scriptures. So from 4 different sources, I verify and I document what I'm sharing with you here tonight in a nutshell, in a Reader's Digest form. So I want you to know this is not something that I've just simply made up. I document it from some of the very best, the most critical, the most scholarly commentaries on the Greek language that are available. So let me repeat this. From the Greek commentators, from the lexicons, from the historical sources that use the word, and they were contemporaries with Paul or before or even after, as well as the New Testament usage of the word. That's 4 separate witnesses. So what is the meaning? What is the definition of "we shall meet him in the air"? Here's what I discovered, folks. And William, I remember sharing this with you and how devastating it is. And as I remember, you were going, "Well, there you go. That's it." And I think it is it. Okay.
I agree. It's very powerful.
The word apontesis, folks, doesn't simply mean to go out, but here the background of the word is this. In the ancient world, when a royal dignitary was going to visit a city within his kingdom, when the emperor was going to visit a city within the empire, he would send out the messengers who would say, "The emperor is coming. The emperor is coming." Those within that city were expected to make preparation. They knew approximately how long it should take for the emperor to get there, the king or whoever that might be. And as the time drew near, watchmen up on the walls to look for the coming of the entourage of the emperor, the king, governor, etc. When they saw him coming, the leaders and the citizens of the city would leave the city, go out to meet him, and you're going, okay, Preston, what's the big deal? We all agree with that. No, we're not through. Here's what you've got to catch. Go out to meet him and then escort him to the city for his royal visit. Now, what does it mean? It means that if we honor the technical meaning of apontesis, and I'll expand on all this in a moment, but if we honor the technical meaning of apontesis, it means that Jesus wasn't coming to take the church away. It means he was coming to be in fellowship with his body on earth forever. Now, obviously, that demands that in any study of that would have to determine what's the nature of that coming, but it demands that it will be a non-literal, non-visible, non-physical coming. We're not going to discuss that so much tonight. We may touch on it a little bit later. But when you go back into Josephus, for instance, Josephus uses this word, and he talks about how the high priest, when he saw Alexander the Great coming into the land of Israel, knowing that Alexander was going to come to destroy the city, conquer Israel, the high priest and his entourage went out to meet Alexander, and they escorted him back to the city, and there they told him of the prophecies of Daniel, which predicted his, Alexander the Great's, rise to power, how that he would rule the world, so to speak. And Alexander the Campbell was so impressed that he did not destroy the city or the country. Now, I realize there are some people who believe that's an interpolation or an addition to Josephus. I don't personally see any reason for believing that. I'm not a Josephus manuscript expert, but the point of fact is, guess what? It's there in many, many, many manuscripts. But here's the point. In those manuscripts, apontesis is being used in this technical sense in which the citizens of Jerusalem went out to meet Alexander the Great and to escort him to the city. He didn't come and take them away. Josephus uses apontesis likewise. When he talks about some of the emperors who had been out to conquer, they were on their way back. The citizens of the city went out to meet him, escorted him back into Rome in a royal procession of victory. Folks, this is the way apontesis was used. Now, could there be exceptions to the usage, that technical usage? Let me be the first to point out, yes, indeed, it could be. However, there's another word, another technical word. And so far as I can tell, there are no exceptions to the technical definition of apontesis and this other word when they are used in the same identical context. And that other word is parousia, or parousia, if you wish to pronounce it that way. Paul uses the word parousia twice in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Now, again, you just have to grasp what's going on here. Number one, you need to understand that most Greek scholars say that the Greek word parousia, when used of the, quote, coming of Christ, it's a technical term to speak of his, quote, final coming. Okay, if that's true, then you have a technical term being used with another technical term. When you have these two technical terms that are being used together, the evidence is overwhelming. I'm not aware, William, I don't know if you've done any follow-up study on the use of apontesis and parousia together or not, but in my follow-up study since writing the book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, I have not found a single example. Now, I obviously may have missed something, but I have not found a single example in which parousia and apontesis are used together in which they do not bear the technical sense of going out to meet, escorting back to the city. Have you done any additional study on that yourself, William?
Well, I've done, I don't know that I would call it additional study, but I mean, at the time that, you first introduced the concept, I've gone back and I've studied it several times. And always when it was used with the word parousia in the text, it was always referring to some royal dignitary that would be coming to visit, a particular city or country, etc., and was always used in that sense.
Yeah. Well, like I said, there may be some exceptional uses out there in which it doesn't mean to go out to meet, to greet, and to come into the city, or to come back into the city. There may be, but I've missed them if there are. And I've never had anyone write to me and object to the technical usage of apontesis when used with parousia who have in any way documented that. Now, I want to be real fair here. There was someone on Facebook who posted a supposed response to my usage of apontesis. Now, I have to tell you, I just have to be very candid here. I think this individual had been coached to give this presentation. But he gave some supposed examples of an exceptional use, but he did not give a single example of apontesis being used with parousia in the same context in which it did not mean go out to meet and escort back. He gave a few examples from the Septuagint in which apontesis was used in simple go out to meet and not necessarily to return. Okay, that's fine. As I said, there may be exceptions in which the word apontesis by itself and in which the context does not include. In other words, in which the context excludes the escorting back into the city. But only the context determines that. The word apontesis doesn't tell you go out to meet and go back with him to where he had been to be called away. It doesn't include that. Apontesis is such an incredibly powerful word. And I've got to tell you what, folks, the thing that absolutely blew me away, and I document this in the book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. And by the way, let me make this offer. If you want to go to my websites, eschatology.org or BibleProphecy.com, if you want to study the evidence that is there, order the book. Make mention when you order that you heard the offer on Two Guys in a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, and I will refund your shipping. It'll save you $5. But one of the things that simply absolutely astounded me, William, and I know it did you if you did the study at the time, is even when you read the lexicons, even the lexicons say, well, here's the meaning of the word, but we can't hardly allow that to stand because it would be so destructive to modern theology. And you're going, so? I mean, and in commentary after commentary after commentary, F.F. Bruce, one of the most highly respected scholars in the world, What, he passed away, William, 15 years ago, something like that now? Well, F.F. Bruce in his commentary, and taking note of apontesis, F.F. Bruce said, there is no question about the technical meaning of this word. Here's what it meant in the first century, but we simply cannot allow it to stand here because it would be so revolutionary and so destructive of all modern theologies. And you read that and you go, did you just read what you just wrote? There's another commentator that I appreciate a lot. His name is John Eady. He did not write an entire series of commentaries on the entire New Testament. But, folks, if you like really, really good linguistic studies, then try to find the commentaries by John Eady, E-A-D-I-E. He does the same thing as F.F. Bruce. But what he does is he gives you all of this documentation. He gives you all of these scholars who tell you and who confirm the technical usage of apontesis. And he essentially says there's no question whatsoever about the technical meaning of apontesis. Oh, but we just can't allow that. We just can't have that. That would completely and totally destroy the modern church's view of the coming of the Lord to take the church out of the world. And my response to that is, so what? If the proper definition of Greek words leads us by necessity to a given interpretation, then do we not owe it to ourselves? Do we not owe it to honesty and integrity and proper exegesis to build our theology not on presuppositions, not on tradition, but on linguistics? I mean, it's just astounding that the scholar after scholar after, and like I said, folks, I document this from source after source after source about how they admit it. And they say there's no question whatsoever that it's a technical word bearing the sense that I've shared with you this evening. But they just can't allow that because it's so destructive to tradition. Now, William, here is Johnny Oxendine, who believes the Lord's coming to take the church off of the earth. So what does apontesis do for Johnny Oxendine's theology?
Well, it's as F.F. Bruce said, it destroys all his modern theology. It's just devastating. And these guys, some of them know Greek. I don't know what his education level and experience and knowledge of Greek is, but I know they all have access to the same resources that we do. Certainly. And they consult them whenever they want to know the meaning of a term. And
when they want to use it to their advantage.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And especially if you're preparing for a lecture where you're going to be talking about somebody else's view, and especially attempting to refute that view, it is obligatory upon you to study everything in that text that might have a bearing on the subject, if you're going to do a proper job at it. As a matter of fact, he should, knowing that there is information on the subject, such as your book, he should have had a copy of that and had the pages well worn by the time that he got to the lecture, so that he could have made comments upon it to refute it if that, was what his, point was. And so, like we've said before, listening stations, they were some of the most shallow, the majority of them. There were a couple in there where they did some good exegetical work. And in the cases where they did do exegetical work, It was pro AD 70.
And Dub McClish's exposition of Daniel 12 was outstanding.
That's exactly right. But the rest of these lectures, they were horrible in terms of any real exegetical research. They were just filled with, a bunch of extraneous comments and derogatory statements about who can believe that and that's crazy and all of that stuff. You got to be out of your mind to believe it. That is not exegesis, and they know it's not exegesis. It is simply their admission of defeat and inability to address these issues. And so if they were coming, if I'm going to talk to someone, I have people asking me now to discuss things that are outside of my area of expertise, okay, which require me to go and do a lot of study in Egyptology and all these other things that I'm not acquainted with. But I'm not going to stand up and claim that I can refute this stuff, that even though I don't believe it in terms of the way they're presenting it, I wouldn't go in, Don, that blind to a presentation and claim that I could refute it. So it's just it doesn't make sense what they're doing, and people need to be aware of it and ought to call them, on the carpet for such irresponsibility in handling the scriptures.
Well, I agree, and that's very, very well stated. I agree with you 100%. If I'm going to be called to address, to refute any position, if it's something I'm totally unfamiliar with, or even if I think I'm familiar with it, but I'm being expected to answer what somebody else is saying about it, then I want to know what they say about it. And if Johnny Oxendine had done any study of any preterist literature, then it did not show in his presentation. He made so many completely irresponsible claims and charges against preterists that none of us believe, or if some believe it, I don't know about it, for certain. But it's just unbelievable. And some of the comments that he made are so, let me see. I want to be as kind here as I possibly can. I don't want to come across as overly harsh. But they are ignorant statements. And by that I mean they show an entire lack of really forceful thought, of logical thought, of critical thinking. And here's what I mean by that. One of the arguments that Johnny Oxendine made was, well, you see, in Matthew chapter 24, we've supposedly got this chapter division at verse 36. But of that day and hour knows no man. And part of the way that he justified that so-called break in the chapter was because, after all, the day of the Lord, Jesus said, is unknown. Because as it was in the days of Noah, they ate, they drank, they married, they gave in marriage, and they did not know until the day came and took them all away. So shall it be in the day of the coming of the Son of Man. So here he uses the story of Noah to prove that the time of the coming of the Lord was to be unknown. William, you've written some things in the past. Something about Noah's boat, that boat won't float, something about that. Why don't you share some thoughts with us on whether or not there were signs of the flood, and since Johnny Oxendine and others would say there are no signs of the coming of Jesus, how does all that work when we come to the comparison of the day of the Lord with the the days of Noah?
Well, that's a very interesting thing, and that was one of the most enjoyable studies I did once I got into it. And I'm trying to think of the actual title of the lesson. I remember Max giving it a shorter title, which I also liked. He called it a no-float boat.
Yeah.
But the title was a boat divided against itself cannot float. I had to look it up online in order to find it. And it's online. People can go there and just look up that title and download it. But one of the things that's said about the coming of the Lord is that it would be as it was in the days of Noah. And not only in the days of Noah, but also in the days of Lot. But particularly with respect to the days of Noah, these brethren have argued for years that there were signs of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., but there were no signs of the return of Christ. And, of course, Don, you did a book on that. What was the title of that book? On Thessalonians. It was actually a little commentary on Thessalonians.
Yeah, it was actually in my work on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, yes. It's included in there.
Right. But you did the book earlier, the little bitty book on it, little track that you did some years ago.
Good grief, I forgot that one.
yeah, you did. But anyway, and that's a good one too, ladies and gentlemen, that you can get, if you can find a copy of it, get your hands on it. But here we have God telling Noah. Now, you got to understand, the coming of the Lord would be as it was in the days of Noah. And God tells Noah to build an ark. Well, I mean, if you think about that, Noah has to build this huge ocean liner, right? And God tells him it's going to be a flood. So as you start, pulling all this wood and everything else together to build this boat, that should be a sign that something is coming. I mean, you couldn't miss it, right? it's like seeing a mountain in the middle of the ocean. So,
hey, Noah, what you doing back there?
Absolutely. So that was a sign. Anybody who had any sense would be able to look at that and say, whoa, it must going to be a lot of water. It's going to take a lot of water for that thing to float, And if you get that much water to raise that boat, it's got to be something pretty significant, especially if he's building it on dry ground, At any rate, then he tells him to bring all the animals into the ark, right? And at the time, after Noah finishes all this, God says to him, Noah did everything that God commanded him. He tells him to get the gopher wood and the measurements, etc. It's all there in Genesis 6. And then the scripture says, after 7 more days. And God told Noah that, he found him righteous in this generation. So he was speaking to Noah's particular generation. He wasn't talking to any other generation. And that's very key. It wasn't for a generation beyond Noah's generation. It was for Noah's generation. He had told him that his spirit would strive with man for about 120 years. So he had some general idea of the time that this was going to take. And then the scripture says, after 7 more days, God had spoken to them and said that he was going to bring the flood. Now, if you had asked Noah prior to what we find in Genesis 7, 1 through 4, when is the flood going to occur? All Noah could have told you was this: it's going to happen in this generation. That sounds very much like Matthew 24:34, doesn't it? But as time went on and as the ark was finished, God appears to him again and says, after 7 more days. Sound like, to me, it was at hand, imminent, shortly to come to pass, and Noah had that information prior to getting in the boat. So he could tell people if they asked him at that time, which was information that was revealed later, when is this going to happen? He could say 7 more days. And then after that 7 days passed, all the animals marching into the ark, Noah and his family in the ark, going up that gangplank, and then all of a sudden it closes of its own accord. God closes the door. Well, I would think that would be a pretty significant sign for anybody that was looking at it.
I would say that about that time, his neighbors are going, oops.
Absolutely. So it was all the signs that led up to the ark. It all happened in Noah's generation. They had both general time and then they had a specific time, very specific time revealed later. And even when the event happened, it didn't take Noah out of the physical universe, and it wasn't an end of the physical universe. And then here we have a scripture that says, as it was in the days of Noah. Makes you wonder whether they actually read Genesis 6 and 7 or not.
That's a great breakdown, William, because it illustrates what I mean when I said that Johnny Oxendine's argument is so ignorant. And again, I'm just trying to be, I'm not trying to be harsh and critical. I'm not trying to be unkind here. But it shows that Johnny Oxendine has not done any critical thinking. Now, I admit, folks, William and I both admit, in our younger days, guess what? We used the same argument that Johnny Oxendine did. I used that argument for years and years and years before I realized the things that William just pointed out, and it's like, wait a minute. What do you mean, as it was in the days of Noah? I argued for years, folks. There were signs of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, but there are not going to be any signs of the final coming of the Lord. And then I'd go over to 2 Thessalonians. I never will forget, this is one of the texts that hit me initially, along with the material that William just gave when I started analyzing what was it really like in the days of Noah. I mean, that was like a wall falling on me. But I also remember 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, because in my younger years, I took the view that the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is the Roman Catholic Church. Well, according to the traditional view in the amillennial world in which William and I were raised, the man of sin, once again, is the Roman, you have the Roman Catholic Church, and the man of sin specifically is the Pope. And at some point of time in the future, the Pope comes back to regain his unquestioned, unchallenged authority in the world. He starts persecuting the true church, and at the height of his power, at the height of the greatest part of the tribulation against the true church, Jesus comes and he destroys the man of sin. Now, I got to tell you, folks, even though I believe that, and that was the dominant view in the amillennial world in which William and I were raised, I can well remember going to lectureships during the Q&A sessions at these lectureships, and when questions about the man of sin and eschatology would be posed, all of a sudden these supposedly scholarly men on the open forum would say, well, we just don't really know a whole lot about that, but we do know that the dispensational world is wrong. Now, we really believe it has something to do with the Roman Catholic Church, but, we don't. On the other hand, we don't know. It's just not what the dispensationalists say. Well, my point is this. If you take that view that the man of sin is the Roman Catholic Pope, then guess what? When the Roman Catholic Pope would begin to regain world power, wouldn't that be a sign, William, of the coming of the end? Seems to me like it would be.
Oh, yeah.
And when he would begin to persecute the church in an unparalleled manner, wouldn't that be a sign?
It most certainly would.
So here we have a text that our own brethren appeal to as talking about the future and the final coming of the Lord, and yet that very text has signs in it. Because, after all, with this man of sin would work with all lying wonders and miracles. So if the Pope were to rise to power again and all of a sudden begin to work false miracles, impressive false miracles, there you go. There's a sign. And so one of the key arguments that I used to use, and this just struck me as like, I can't make that argument anymore. That's a false argument. Because right here in 2 Thessalonians, there are signs there. Okay. So everywhere we turn, we see the weakness of Johnny Oxendine's argument, because he appeals to Matthew 24:37 and following to prove that the coming of the Lord is unknown by comparing it with the days of Noah. And yet in the days of Noah, there were definitive signs, there were generic signs, and there were specific signs, there were positive signs, and boy, oh boy, I don't know how you'd ever deny that. I just simply don't know how you would deny that. And by the way, William, you brought up Lot and his wife. Weren't there some signs back then?
Oh, absolutely. There were signs with them as well. When God told them that he was going to bring the judgment, and you find where they were to, leave the city, and as they were going, Lot's wife turned to a pillar of salt. All of those were signs that were leading up to the judgment. It was after they left the city that it came. They were going through some of the same situations that the people or had the same conditions that the people in the days of Noah had during that time. But in each case, there were signs leading up to the last day of the event.
Let me ask you a question, William.
Sure.
This may seem almost off topic, but I really believe it is directly on topic. In all of the days of the Lord, including, by the way, the flood of Noah, didn't God send inspired, infallible, authoritative prophets to warn the people of the coming judgment?
That's right. The angels were a part of that, especially in Lot's situation. And even with the prayer that Abraham had, this was an example of it as well. Remember when Abraham interceded to God on their behalf? All of that was a part of the signs for what was taking place. And in every case,
yes.
That's, of course, is what the Scripture says, that God does nothing except he first reveals it to his prophets, or to his servants through the prophets. So there you have it.
Back there in Amos chapter 3. So that raises the question. And when God sent those prophets and said judgment was coming, that judgment came in the generation that the prophets spoke in. When they said it was near, it was genuinely near. Now, we come to the New Testament, and we have Jesus saying his coming was to be in his generation, Matthew 24, verse 34. And we have Peter saying the end of all things is drawn near. We have Paul saying the end of this world is passing away. The days have been shortened. The end of the ages has come upon us. We have James saying the coming of the Lord has drawn near. We have John being told by Jesus, who was told by the Father, these things must shortly come to pass. And yet here we are 2,000 years after that declaration by the living, inspired, authoritative, infallible prophets of God in the first century, including the Son of God, and supposedly that day of the Lord hasn't come yet. There's a huge disconnect here, folks. Let me repeat this. Everywhere in the Old Testament, God said the day of the Lord was coming on a given nation, whether it was Assyria or Egypt or Babylon or the 10 northern tribes or Jerusalem. When he sent his prophet, that judgment fell in that generation. And yet, we're supposed to believe that Jesus sent his apostles to declare that his coming was coming real soon, and it still hasn't happened for 2,000 years. Again, I think there's a huge, huge, huge disconnect here. Now, what's interesting and fascinating about this, obviously, is the fact that Johnny Oxendine and those men on the Bellview Church of Christ lectureship agree that Jesus came in the first century in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. They agree that Matthew chapter 24 predicted that event. They agree that Matthew 24:34 said it would happen in that generation. So they would agree in principle. They would agree in principle that God did send his inspired, infallible, authoritative prophets to speak of impending first century judgment, and that first century judgment came. Where then are the prophets to declare the, quote, final coming of the Lord? And if there is to be another final coming of the Lord, William, wouldn't God's previous modus operandi indicate, as you cited there in Amos chapter 3, verse 7, wouldn't that indicate that God would send at some time in the future some inspired, infallible, authoritative prophets to say the coming of the Lord is at hand?
It most certainly would. If not, he would be deviating from his pattern and from his moral responsibility and love for his creation.
And yet, we are told by Johnny Oxendine and every man on that forum, no, the age of miracles, the age of prophets has ceased. There are no more living prophets. There will be no living prophets. Well, folks, if there are no living prophets, and if there will be no living prophets to declare the coming of the Lord, then guess what? The coming of the Lord happened in the first century in fulfillment of the first century declarations of the imminence of the day of the Lord. Well, hey, you know what, William? I just looked at the clock, and we're out of time. Folks, thank you so much for joining us for Two Guys in the Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. We will next week. William, I believe that Doug Post is the next on our agenda to review. So, folks, be looking for that. We'll make the announcement of it, and we'll see you next week on Two Guys in the Bible, a voice you can trust. With that, I'll say good night, and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in the Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day, and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.